Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 2. So in this chapter we're going to go over the vehicle brief, we'll go over research and how that can help us during the modelling process. We'll talk about things that we can do to help texturing, look dev, rigging, animation and the FX teams downstream. And we'll also go over how we can get our references set up nicely and we can get our cameras set up in Maya and we can start blocking this vehicle out. So like I mentioned in the introduction, we'll be modelling this really cool looking utility truck called a Mercedes-Benz Unimog, which at the time of production in the mid-80s was considered like the Swiss Army knife of trucks basically. And the reason for that is because this thing came in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. It was built for all kinds of different use cases, so militarily, agriculturally, labour-intensive tasks, extreme weather conditions, all kinds of terrains. You know, this truck was built to withstand sort of anything really, hence why it was referred to as the Swiss Army knife of trucks at the time. And it's still around today. This example I thought was super cool to use. And, you know, so why is this all good to know? It's because whenever we're modelling anything, whether that's a vehicle like this, or a prop, or a creature, a character, or an environment maybe, it's always really good to do some research beforehand and get a bit of a history for what you're going to do. You know, ultimately we're trying to tell a story through these assets, so it's always nice to sort of get a feel for things, maybe what it was used for, its intended purposes, you know, how old it might be. You're always going to find some interesting tidbits that can either help you in the modelling process, maybe add or change some things to help tell that story. So having some research that you can always refer back to is just really great to have. Another thing that's always really useful as well is whether we can get some measurements to help us out. So especially with vehicles like this, it's always useful to get, you know, some wheelbase measurements, maybe the wheel track measurements, some ideas of like the length and height of the vehicle. Small things like that can actually help quite a lot through the process just to make sure we've got everything measured correctly. So I always like to make some notes beforehand with measurements like that as well. Ultimately, it's going to help us and even other departments tell an even better story. You know, things like vehicle dynamics or features that it had in real life. We might not even know about that, and it can actually help us maybe make an even more interesting asset or more interesting shot. So that was it for our research, and now we're going to talk about the vehicle brief. So the vehicle brief is really important because ultimately that will decide how we approach this model. So we need to think about how close we see it to the camera. Is it close up like we can see here in this reference image, or do we only see this vehicle far away, for example? For the sake of this tutorial though, we're going to assume that we can see the vehicle close up, like in this shot, and therefore we need to think about what elements we can capture in the geometry, what elements we can capture as displacement or textures for better control. We're expecting to see this truck move, and we're expecting to see the doors open, so we're going to have to build quite a nice interior as well for that if we see the doors open. So in our brief, we're expecting this vehicle to move, we're expecting this vehicle to drive around, and we're expecting to see this vehicle from multiple cameras. So we'll be modelling it under the assumption that we can see it from any angle with the same amount of detail. And we might also have to think about damage variance too. So we don't necessarily need to cover that in this tutorial, but sometimes it's actually good to think ahead for whether we're going to have damages later on or not. So for example, this will be our clean version right now, but we may have to have a damage variant where the vehicle may have crashed through a fence or it might have grazed a brick wall. So we may have to have a damage variant. And we also need to think about how we're going to set up this vehicle in our Maya scene. So like I mentioned, sometimes we actually don't have LiDAR scans and we don't have photogrammetry. So we're going to be using the sort of tried and true old school method of just using the reference images that we've been handed from the client. We're going to be eyeballing it and using our research and measurements to fill in those gaps. So first things first, let's look at our references. So I'll be using PureRef for this tutorial. You don't have to use PureRef, you can use any kind of image viewer that you would like to use. I'll just be using PureRef on my other monitor, so you won't always see this, but I'll be referring to it as we go through the modeling process. And we've got a lot of really nice crisp images here, so lots of nice details, really nice close-ups here of all of the features like the winch and the headlamps, tail lights. It's also going to be super useful for texturing whenever we get to that too, so all the metals and rubbers, any kinds of other materials we've got there like plastics and glass. So all of this is going to be great for helping us lock in those details. It looks like we've pretty much got everything we need here. We've also got our wheel track here and wheelbase measurements, so that will be really useful when we line up our cameras, because having those measurements is going to give us a pretty solid base to start off with in terms of accuracy. We've also got treads here as well, the number of tread teeth going around the wheel. We've got some wheel nuts. And another thing worth mentioning is that I also like to run all of my images through Lightroom or Photoshop as well. I basically just like to boost the brightness, maybe play with the contrast a bit more, because generally speaking, when we get these images, they might be in a soundstage, so it might be quite dark, or it might be that the location they're on is quite contrasty. So I generally like to just boost the brightness if I can, and it actually reveals more details as a result. So with that out of the way, we can get these images into Maya. So first things first, I'm using Maya 2024. For this tutorial series, I won't be using any specific tools, any bespoke scripts or anything like that. And I'm doing that just so when you're following along with me, you know that everything that we're going to do here, we're doing with the native toolset. So what I'm doing here is just setting up our measurements. So this is the wheel track, the wheel base. And when we have these set up, it will give us a good base for our wheels, which I'm going to make now as well. So we'll just do a super low res tire for now, and then we can snap those to each point of our measurement. And then when we're happy with those wheels snapped into place, we can just mirror those over. And then we can also flip the normals as well. So when we've got these in a good place, we can see that our measurements look pretty good. They're snapping to each hubcap of the wheel, so we know that our measurements should be pretty accurate. We can move that into the center a bit more, and then we can also set up our first camera just to get an idea of how it's going to look. So we're setting these cameras up under the assumption that we don't have any information for the reference images. So for example, metadata like the focal length or the film back, what camera it might have been used to take these images. And I've actually had quite a few instances in the past where we've just not had much information at all to go on, and we've just had to eyeball it basically. And this actually happens more often than not when you're in film and TV. So with that in mind, I thought we'd just guess something like 80mm to start off with. They're quite wide shots, so we're sort of, we'll get that camera in place, we can scale the wheels up. So I don't tend to be overly pedantic about matching every surface at the start, because when we bring our second camera in, it will fall apart somewhat. So I like to just get things in a good position to begin with, and then we can start doing our second camera and starting to get them both lined up. So with those wheels in a pretty good position, we can move on to our second camera. So this is going to be our front view. So we'll just hide our image plane so we can only see them in each camera, so they're not in our viewport in the way. And then we can bring a camera in, we can import our image reference, we can put the depth back by about 2000 just so it's not in the way, there's no intersections. We can change the focal length to 80 like the side camera, and then we can get those wheels roughly lined up. And as you can see, we're starting to get in the ballpark on both cameras. So obviously this truck isn't orthographically front and side dead on. There is a bit of an angle with this this image, the way it was taken by the photographer, so we have to account for some of that as well. So obviously, as you can see, the back wheels are slightly higher than the front wheels. We just need to sort of make some considerations and line those up as best we can. It's not going to be perfect because ultimately there are various things that we have to take into account, right? So we've got floor camber, as in the gradient might be different on one side to the other. And we also have to bear in mind that this truck is 40 years old. So like many things that we'll model, nothing's going to be perfect most of the time, especially with older props or vehicles. There's always going to be oddly shaped panels, things don't line up like they used to, there's going to be some drooping, wear and tear, there's buckling and bowing across panels and all kinds of things. So it's always good to remember that we aren't going to line up everything one-to-one anyway. We always have to account for any surfaces that don't line up, any offsets. It's always good to look out for those things whilst you're lining up these cameras too. I mean, we can even see on the front view that the windshield doesn't fully line up with the top parcel shelf. So it's just worth bearing in mind, you don't want to get too distracted or bogged down with why a particular edge might not line up, because the chances are not everything will line up. So whenever I'm blocking in these shapes like the cockpit or the wheels, or we do any of the more specific shapes like the bumpers or the parcel shelf, I will keep it all straight for the process of modelling the clean version, because we don't want to be modelling in details when any of our pieces of geometry have been rotated slightly to match the reference. We want to match the reference wherever we can, but we have to remember that when we actually model the hero details on these pieces of geometry, we want to keep it nice and flush. We can go back at the end on our final pass and we can add back these rotations and these offsets, right? So don't worry about that for now, just keep everything nice and straight, all the surfaces nice and flush, and we can come back at the end and add those back in. I mean, sometimes it's actually worth bearing in mind that the rigging team might not want these offsets either, so there have actually been vehicles in the past that I've done where the vehicle is so slanted on one side, whether that's because, you know, the suspension or the shock might have been damaged. So sometimes things like that can happen. So when we go back at the end and we add these imperfections back and these offsets, we just need to make sure that they're not significant, because ultimately that might slow the rigging team down. So whenever you have that, whenever you've got a vehicle that is really offset, or really slanted or anything like that, it's sometimes best to talk to the rigger first and say, hey, would you like me to keep the vehicle straight at the end, or would you like me to add this offset back in? Sometimes the people rigging the vehicle would actually just say, keep it straight. So with that basic shape out of the way for the cockpit, we can just move on to our bumper. And again, super basic shape just to line everything up. So we'll extrude those faces just so we can get our basic bumper shape in there. And when we've got it in a roughly good position, we can line it to our side camera. And in our front camera, you can see that things aren't quite lining up yet. So our wheels might look fine, but our bumper is thrown off slightly. So I'll mirror that over. We'll flip the normals, we'll combine it, we'll weld those edges, and then we can grab our edges, we can bevel them so that we can just get some extra edges lining up on the side camera. So all I'm going to do here is just go back to my front camera, and then we can just take a look at how much we need to move the camera to make that bumper fit better. So we unlock the camera, we can bring it forwards a little bit, we can shimmy the camera around a little bit and just make sure everything can line up a little bit better than it did before. And then when we're happy with that, we can kind of lock it back in place. But remember, it's not going to be perfect, and we don't necessarily need it to be perfect right now anyway, because we're still refining all of these shapes and we're making sure that our cameras line up over time. So it's still not going to be perfect right now. There's always going to be some camera movements as we go along. So as long as we're getting closer and closer throughout this process, that's the direction we want to be moving in. So I'll just keep refining this bumper shape. I'll have a look at my cockpit shape and my tyres and just see how it meets those. And then when this is in a good place, we can take a look at what we've got so far. So we can start to work our way back a little bit towards the rear of the vehicle. We can just quickly look at our pure ref just to see if there's any details that we need to look out for. So it's a pretty basic shape in our pure ref, so we can just do that side panel for now and start with a cube. And we can start to refine the shape. So I'll just cut in some quick edge loops there. We can start to match the wheel arch wall, and I like to just keep every edge straight, like I said before, just keep it nice and clean. It might be a blocking model, but sometimes these pieces could actually serve as a good base for our hero geometry as well. So it's nice to just keep everything clean wherever we can. So we'll just wrap up this piece for the back, and then we can look at setting up our third camera. So in our pure ref, we can just make that a little bit bigger, and we can look for our back view. So I think that's probably the best view we've got. So we're cutting off some of the tyres actually. It's not a huge deal. We can live with that. So we'll bring in our third camera, and we can put in our 8mm focal length. We can find that rear image, and we can push the image depth back, and we can start to line things up. So I'm just going to go through now and just tighten this camera up, try and get it lined up as best I can, looking at the tyres, looking at the rear bumper, and just trying to get a rough position going there. So with that in mind, we can sort of drop that for now and go back to our front camera. We can grab that part of the back panel and we can just push that in a little bit. And then we can go back and adjust our edges. Again, I'm not being too precious with this stuff because we have to line up our third camera still, so things can change slightly. We can look at our pure ref, any other details we need to put in there. And then we can flip it and we can invert those edges, and then we can start lining up both sides. So again, it's not going to be perfect because the ground is clearly on a slope, and the left side of the pickup truck to the right side, there is some offset there that we spoke about before, so we have to bear that in mind. The surfaces clearly don't line up between the left and right side, so again, just bear that in mind. We don't have to be precious about lining those panels up. And it's in a fairly good spot now, so we can just keep tweaking. And then when we're happy with that, maybe we can do another part. So we can just do those railings as well. So just a basic cylinder, and then we can just jam that in there, roughly get the radius of that sorted out. We can adjust the edges. And something I often do that you might find useful is if you grab your edges and you make sure your move tool is selected, you can actually hold the control key and you can scale using your middle mouse. So when we've got that out of the way and it looks good, we'll duplicate that and drop it down for the second rail. And then we'll make those smaller pieces as well. We'll just drop those roughly into place. Now another way we can do this is if we use Control D, we can duplicate that piece. But if we do Shift D and we drag that over and then keep repeating that keyboard shortcut, the same gap is applied every time we duplicate. And then we'll just go in and adjust those and just get them roughly in position. And then we can just push that rail into place and match the camera a little bit better. So we can just finish up those rails, we can just mirror those over, and then we can adjust the camera just a little bit more just to make sure those rails sit a little bit more nicely. And then we can do our rear bumper. So again, super basic shape. We've just got a basic flat panel here with a cutout at the bottom for that bumper. So we'll just get some edge loops in there, delete those faces. We can play around with the scale a little bit and we can start matching it to our side camera. Looks pretty good. Get that in position. And then we can do that flatbed part of the back of the truck as well. Just a plain, get that in there as well. Adjust those tyres a little bit more, just so we can match that camera just a little bit more nicely. So overall, it looks like our tyres are slightly out. And again, the wheels might be rotated from the steering wheel slightly. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So I'd just keep the wheels straight at all times. And again, this is going to help the rigging team out because we don't need to have the asset kicked back to us from that team and be told, hey, the wheels are out of alignment. So just keep those straight. So I've just jumped ahead here slightly just to make some railings for the top and a U shape for that rear panel and the tyres on top. And we're going to be softening our cabin just a little bit just to match the ref more. We're just going to refine that a little bit more, match it to the ref a bit better. And then when we're happy with that, we can just add those softer edges at the top. Maybe we can sort this bumper out while we're here. So just find a good ref image. So it's actually a flat platform for that winch to sit on. So we can fix that. And then we can just make sure that lines up nicely in the side view. And then maybe go back to our rear view and just do that bumper that we missed out earlier. So it's similar to the front. We've got that big beveled edge. And we'll just start off with a cube, bevel it, get it into position, and then we can see some score marks on the sides where the surface changes direction slightly, so we can just get that in there too. And we don't really see this from the other angles, so we haven't got to worry about that too much. We can just rely on our pure ref angles and then our rear view as well. We've got the side camera obviously a little bit, so that helps us, but overall it's a pretty basic shape. So when we've sort of got that where we are happy with it, we can call that done for now. And then we can add in those tail lights. So again, just a blocking shape for that, just so we can make sure we've got something in there and it's all looking pretty good across both cameras. Mirror it over. And then when we're happy with that, we can just move on to the railing at the back. Might as well do that while we're here too. So we can just reuse that rail that we made before for our back rail. And we can change the edges, just alter those a little bit. We can just scale it slightly. Get those vertical pieces sorted out as well. And then we can just extrude those faces a little bit and get that corner shape in there. Cool. And then if we're happy with that, we can just adjust it slightly just to match the ref a little bit more. Look at our pure ref, see what it's like. Yeah, all good. And then we can make sure it's okay in our side view. And then if we're happy, we can mirror it and then it should look good on both sides. So at this point, we'll just continue with the rest of the shapes. So We were looking at that bend before and just adding that piece of support to it as well. Again, just using a basic cube just to get that in there, and we'll just match that for the side camera. Look at our rear camera. Go back to the side, see if it lines up. And then next we can sort of focus on the top roof rack again. So I'll just use another cylinder and we'll just extrude that and make our flat surface for those railings to sit onto. Obviously it bends around, 30 degrees halfway, so we'll try and match that as best we can. Look at our pure ref just to confirm that, and then we'll mirror that over, get that into place. Again, it may not match on both sides, as I could sort of see here, so we can adjust the camera a little bit just to get those edges a bit closer, but it's just worth noting again that this shelf is clearly offset slightly. We can kind of see that if you look at the top of the windshield as well, and if you look at the top headlamps, there is a slight offset, more biased towards the left, I'd say. So we're still going to keep our shape straight, but again, just always good to remember that it's not going to be perfect. And it might seem like I'm a bit sporadic with what shapes I'm choosing to do, but overall I'm just trying to flesh out as much as I sort of can. So I might be going from the front, I might be going to the back at some points, I might go to the side view. I'm just generally fleshing out the overall silhouette of the vehicle, so I'm kind of just bouncing around and seeing what else I can find that we can quite easily just jam in there basically. So I'm just finishing off this top roof rack, just getting those pipe shapes in there as well, and then mirroring that over, getting into place. It's all lining up pretty well now. Not being too precious about it. Checking our pure ref, we can just quickly soften these edges as well here. So kind of like what we did earlier with the back of the cabin, we're just going to do that to the front now on the bumper as well. So we'll just clean up the shape. I wasn't very happy with the wireframe here, so I just thought I'd clean it up a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, because again, we might not even use this as our starting surface, but as our blocking shape, it's fine. I just wanted to tidy up those edges a little bit more because they were just sort of unnecessarily webby. So that was out of the way, and then we can go back to our parcel shelf and we can just jam those brackets in there as well and begin doing the arms that hold that shelf in place. Just checking our pure ref to see how that looks. And then I often reuse shapes I've done as well, just to get a shape that much quicker basically than starting off with a cube every single time. So we'll finish off this arm that's holding up the top rack, just getting that in place, matching the width, and then we can mirror that over, make sure it looks okay, and then we can move on to the wheel arches. So this is where I'll bring in the pure ref, because it's good to get a 3/4 view for things like this as well. So we're getting a little bit more specific with our shape here. We don't have to go crazy with this at the moment. I just want to get something in there just so we can fill that gap. So we can extrude some of the edges. We can create that sort of gradient from the top to the edge of the lip of the bumper. And then we can bring that in, keep it straight. Because remember, the vehicle in this image reference might not be dead on to the camera. We can clearly see that the wheel is turning a little bit, so we have to account for things like that. Looking at that shape and how we can get that in there. It's a bit droopy, so we can always alter that at the end when we do our breakup pass. And then we can get some headlights in there, just basic cylinders, push those in, and then we just make sure those are in place. We're adjusting the bonnet and the bumper just to bring that in line a bit more. And everything's lining up pretty nicely now, so we can just finish off that door there. And then just add a few more edge loops. And I'm just bringing in that window ledge just so we've got something there just to get a good shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, we're just doing something simple just to get that in there and see if it lines up a bit nicer. And then when we've got that in place, we can check our pure ref again, find some more angles of it. So it's quite bulbous when it comes from the bottom of the window, it sort of comes out and then drapes down. So we're just going to get that in there, and we'll straighten out the door, see how it looks in our front and side view. Getting closer, and again the edge loops don't look too tidy on this, but we might not even use this as our hero surface. It's just a great blocking shape. So just A being between the reference camera and our model. So I'm just A being with isolate selection. So isolate selection can be toggled with Control and 1 on the keyboard. And then just throwing in some petrol cans here at the top. Just basic shapes for those. Checking my pure F again. This vehicle's somewhat asymmetrical on the underside, so there are things that we don't see on one side that we see on the other side. So the fuel tank, for example, we can just basically jam a shape in there for now. We can always refine that later on when we go to our references in pure F and match that up. And then just checking again, we can do this little exhaust pipe coming out of the top. And just getting the shape of it, that snake shape sort of loosely in there. So not going too crazy with this, just getting something simple in there. And extruding the bottom, and then we'll pull that out just to make that shape to stick into the bonnet. And then we'll go back to the cabin again, and we'll just make those final adjustments to the window just so it can sit a bit nicer to the bonnet. Just pull those sides in. And then we're AB with the reference. So everything's lining up quite nicely now. So as you can see over the course of our blocking pass, we've slowly refined our cameras, we've built up our blocking geo, and we've made those alterations as we go along. And I think that's the best way of doing it because, it's so easy to spend such a long time on the first or second camera lining those two up. I know that when I started modeling vehicles, I really struggled to keep that pace going. I was spending too much time focusing on why various edges weren't meeting too early on in the blocking process. So what I've learned over time is that if you just keep going at a good pace, and if you just keep blocking out more and more shapes, it really helps you just build out your blocking geo, and you can tighten those cameras just a bit quicker, I think. So with that in mind, we'll just quickly wrap up these wheels now. We'll just soften the edges just to sort of match the silhouette of the tyres a bit more. We'll do that shape there, that one there, and then here we are. So we have our blocking model. We have it matching our side camera pretty good. Everything looks pretty good here. So everything looks good there. As I mentioned earlier, we can see here that there is an offset, so these high beams are actually slightly off. This one's a bit more straight than that one, so things like that. Obviously we're going to have asymmetry that we can fix at the end, but other than that, this is good to go. So in a typical pipeline, we might want to think about just grouping this together. We can rename everything, we can check this in, and this might be useful for the layout team. It might be useful for the rigging team just to get an idea on what sort of things they'll be testing. And then from there, we can start to do our hero pass. So I hope that all made sense. And on the next chapter, we'll be going over various parts of the vehicles that we can start off with first, things that we might want to look at that we can do in the geometry or as a texture map. And then we'll start doing our details. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in chapter 3.